Hi, I'm Jonah Snyder. This is the Decades Project, and today we're going to be talking about the 1950s. The 1950s were the first time America had truly been prosperous and peaceful since the 1920s. After having suffered through the Great Depression and the Second World War, America wanted to return to the status quo. But there were a lot of things that changed in America following the Second World War, and we see a lot of those start to come to the surface in the 1950s. Now, the first thing that we need to establish is the 1950s starts in 1949, and the first event that cements 1949 being the definitive year that starts the 1950s is the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a military alliance that cemented America's place as a protector of Western democracy and said that it would stay involved in the politics of Europe, which was a big reversal from the post-World War I reaction where America became more of an isolationist nation. The second thing is the end of the Berlin airlift, which was one of the first major butting of heads between the Soviet Union and the United States, where the Soviet Union would not allow supplies to go to West Berlin, which was under control of the Allies. So the Allies responded by airlifting medical supplies and food and anything that the city needed. It ended May 12, 1949, and it could have very well started the Third World War. Now, the thing that really gets the 1950s going and defines the next 40 years of American history is the Soviets getting the A-bomb, or the atomic bomb, on August 29th, 1949. This event really cements the conflict of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and the United States both being nuclear powers that are both on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And this conflict and potential to create a Third World War defines the culture of the 1950s and then even the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. One of the first significant events of the 1950s is the beginning of the baby boom in 1950. As people came back from the war, there was a massive boom in population as newlywed couples had families, and this lends to the creation of suburbia in this time period. The next is on June 25th, 1950, the Korean War begins when North Korea invades South Korea. This is significant because it leads to the first police action by the United Nations, which was led by the United States. And it's just another example of how important the U.S. became in the post-war world as a protector of democracy and freedom and being involved in the world. The Korean War would end in 1953 with an armistice, but technically the war still goes on to this day. A year later on that date, June 25th, 1951, the first colored television is broadcast by CBS, and this is significant because of a new technological medium for things to be communicated. And while TV only starts to become popular and doesn't become as widespread until 1953, by 1960, over 80% of American households have a television in their house. And this sets up a lot of how news is received in the upcoming decades. In 1952, the first polio vaccine is developed, which essentially eradicates the disease around the world. This was notable because thousands of children every year would contract polio and die or remain paralyzed below the legs for their whole lives. A notable example of this was FDR, who had polio and could not walk unaided. Then, November 4th, 1952, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a war hero from World War II, was elected the 34th President of the United States. And his election really represents the return to more conservative and smaller government policies after large government spending during the Second World War and before that during the New Deal. Next, in the 1950s, we see an example of the height of the Red Scare, which was the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg on June 19, 1953. The Red Scare had been a purge of believed communist sympathizers in the government and in public. Senator McCarthy, who had led this, was notable for his McCarthyism and believing that they had to do everything in their power to rid the United States of the Reds, or communists. Now, McCarthy soon fell out of popularity due to his accusations of higher powerful positions, and the Red Scare really ends in 1957 when Senator McCarthy dies. The next is May 17th, 1954, one of the first real victories of the Civil Rights Movement in Brown versus the Board of Education. This is notable because it bans segregation. Now, this court case would be upheld several times again throughout the 1950s, but would not really be obeyed until the later Civil Rights Acts of 1960 and 1964, when the federal government got involved in enforcing these laws. But it was very significant in the desegregation of schools. Next, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a bus, and the Montgomery bus boycotts begin. This was another one of the events that really launches the civil rights movement in America, and also makes nonviolent protest against the existing government more popular, and is part of the reason why civil rights ends up working out. On January 28th, 1956, Elvis Presley makes his television debut, and rock and roll becomes a mainstream force in American music and culture. A notable thing about this is Elvis is the first superstar really to go famous because of television, and the style of rock and roll is a profoundly American creation that affected many American genres throughout the years. Then, on October 4th, 1957, Sputnik is launched into space by the Soviets, and the space race begins. Sputnik caused fear in the American public because the belief was if they can launch a small beach ball-sized satellite into orbit, what could they do next? Could they launch nuclear weapons? And the American public really became afraid of the Soviet power. Now, what the American government did in order to ease the fears of the American public following the launch of Sputnik was create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or as we know it today, NASA. NASA would have a big impact in our American history, especially throughout the 1960s. Its developments in technology gave us many innovations that are still in use today, and would eventually land the first man on the moon, winning the space race. On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro wins the Cuban Revolution. Now, this is important because the United States allowed a communist power to take over a local Latin American country that was 90 miles away from Florida. And the United States at this point started an embargo on the revolutionary regime of Cuba, which still exists today, on all supplies and food going to the island. On August 21st, 1959, Hawaii becomes the 50th state of the Union. And to this date, it is the last state that has entered the Union. And this is notable because it really ends a lot of American expansionism, because we don't acquire any new territories and we haven't got any states, and the last vestiges of American imperialism has been laid to rest. Then, on May 6, 1960, the Civil Rights Act of 1960 is passed and then signed by Eisenhower. This helped to eliminate loopholes that had existed in the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This included extending the life of the Civil Rights Administration, which ensured that civil rights are followed, and then also protected voters more so than before, and mandated that a federal power oversee the voting all across the country. This was another victory again for civil rights that eventually leads to the bigger Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the later amendments that came from the civil rights era. Finally, the 1950s end on November 8th, 1960, when the young John F. Kennedy is elected the 35th President of the United States. This ends the 1950s because the Republican dominance that had been seen in this time and a conservative return to pre-war times ends, and a new young and liberal figure has taken over American politics and leads them into a truly new and dynamic period in our history. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.